March 1934. The residents of Mason, Ohio, woke up to a bizarre and terrifying phenomenon. Their rain gutters were playing music. Faucets hummed with voices. Unlit light bulbs suddenly glowed in the middle of the night. It wasn't a supernatural event. It was the 500,000-watt roar of WLW, a radio signal so violently powerful it could be heard halfway across the globe, forcing the U.S. government to urgently demand it be turned down. This was the terrifying peak of Powell Crosley Jr.'s empire. At its zenith, the Crosley Corporation wasn't just a radio company. It was an industrial monolith. It operated the most powerful broadcasting station on Earth, manufactured millions of affordable radios that connected a fractured nation, built revolutionary refrigerators, produced vital munitions for World War II, and employed thousands across sprawling Cincinnati factories. They were the undisputed king of the American living room. Yet, less than 2 decades later, the deafening roar of the assembly lines faded into an absolute, haunting silence. The massive factories were completely gutted. The monumental broadcasting tower stood as a quiet relic of a forgotten age. And the Crosley name, once synonymous with authentic American innovation, was stripped, sold, and slapped onto cheap foreign-made novelty turntables. How does an industrial titan, a man hailed as the Henry Ford of radio, lose an empire of such staggering magnitude? How does a massive company that shaped the daily habits of millions of lives simply vanish from the map? Welcome to Cincinnati. This is not just the story of a cheap radio. It is a profound, cautionary tale of relentless ambition, devastating corporate blind spots, and the tragic, total collapse of an American manufacturing giant. Every industrial myth begins with a sequence of spectacular failures. Before Powell Crosley Jr. became a titan of the airwaves, before his name was stamped onto the steel of monolithic factories and the dials of millions of machines, he was a man intimately acquainted with the bitter taste of commercial defeat. He was by nature a dreamer obsessed with the mechanical frontier, constantly chasing the roaring promise of the early 20th century. He tried to build automobiles. His first attempt, a vehicle called the Marathon 6, collapsed before it ever truly hit the road. He tried his hand at manufacturing cycle cars, advertising services, and even a device to hold phonograph needles. For years, Crosley was a brilliant mind trapped in a cycle of false starts, searching for the one spark that would ignite his empire. That spark did not come from a boardroom meeting or a grand stroke of corporate strategy. It came from a child's simple request. It was February 1921. The United States was stepping out of the shadow of the First World War and stepping into a new, electrifying decade. The newest witchcraft captivating the nation was radio. Invisible waves carrying human voices, music, and news directly through the thin air. It was nothing short of technological magic. But this magic was fiercely guarded by a wall of wealth. In 1921, a manufactured radio receiver was a luxury item, a grand piece of parlor furniture reserved for the affluent. On Washington's birthday, Powell Crosley's 9-year-old son, Powell III, asked his father for one of these magical boxes. Crosley, a man who loved machines and loved his son, took the boy to a local precinct of technology in Cincinnati to purchase a receiver. The clerk presented them with a standard unit. The price tag read $130. In today's money, that would be nearly $2,000. It was an astronomical sum for a working-class family, and a steep price even for a moderately successful businessman. Crosley stared at the machine. He did not see a luxury item. He saw a collection of basic, inexpensive parts hiding behind a wall of artificial prestige. He refused to pay the ransom. Instead, he bought a 25-cent pamphlet on how to build a radio, a piece of galena crystal, a coiled wire, and a few basic components. Returning home, he and his son spent the afternoon winding wire around a repurposed Quaker Oats box. By the end of the day, for a fraction of the cost, they were pulling faint, ghostly voices out of the Cincinnati ether. For the boy, it was a fun afternoon project. For the father, it was a profound, world-shifting revelation. If he could build a functional radio receiver for a few dollars, why was the industry charging $130? The answer was scale and intention. The existing manufacturers were building radios for the elite. Crosley suddenly realized the monumental blind spot of the entire industry. They were ignoring the masses. The true power of the machine age wasn't in creating expensive toys for the rich, it was in democratizing technology. If he could mass-produce a reliable, affordable radio, he wouldn't just be selling a product. He would be selling the future to the everyday American. This was the birth of the Crosley Radio Corporation. The philosophy was brutally simple, yet utterly revolutionary. Good technology at the lowest possible price. He immediately set to work designing a crystal set that could be manufactured cheaply and quickly. He named it the Harco. While competitors were selling radios for over $100, Crosley released the Harco to the market with a price tag of just $20. The response was tidal. The working class, the factory laborers, the farmers out in the isolated plains, the shopkeepers, suddenly had a ticket to the grand national conversation. The demand was so violent, so immediate, that Crosley's modest phonograph cabinet factory on the west side of Cincinnati had to transform overnight. The quiet hum of woodworking was replaced by the frantic, electric energy of mass production. The factory landscape shifted into a beautifully chaotic symphony of industry. Hundreds of workers were brought in. The air grew thick with the acrid metallic scent of soldering iron rosin and the sharp smell of fresh-cut lumber for cabinets. This was the era before the sterile, automated assembly lines of today. The early Crosley factory was a place of hands and sweat. Young women with nimble fingers sat in long, regimented rows, winding copper coils, and meticulously soldering fragile vacuum tube connections. Men hauled massive crates of raw materials across the sprawling wooden floors. It was a community of labor, breathing life into wood, wire, and glass. Every completed radio that rolled off the line was a tiny, affordable miracle destined for a farmhouse in Iowa or a cramped tenement in New York. Crosley had unlocked the true potential of the American industrial machine. He wasn't just building radios. He was building an audience. He had tapped into the deep, unfulfilled yearning of the public to be connected to the wider world. The profits from the Harco and soon the upgraded Harco Senior poured in like a flood. The failed automobile maker had finally found his engine. He was no longer a struggling entrepreneur. He was the undisputed pioneer of affordable broadcasting hardware. Yet as the thousands of radios shipped out of the Cincinnati factory, a new, unforeseen problem began to emerge. Crosley had given the masses their magical wooden boxes. He had given them the ears to listen. But as he looked across the rapidly expanding landscape of his new empire, he realized a critical flaw in the ecosystem. What good were millions of ears if there was nothing worth listening to? The $20 revelation had built the foundation, but to truly conquer the living rooms of America, Powell Crosley Jr. was going to have to control the air itself. A radio receiver, divorced from a signal, is nothing more than an elegant arrangement of dead wood, cold glass, and coiled copper. Powell Crosley Jr. understood this fundamental truth faster and more acutely than any of his competitors. By the end of 1921, his sprawling facilities in Cincinnati were churning out thousands of affordable units, shipping them across a nation starved for modern connection. The workers in his plants, their hands calloused from shaping mahogany cabinets and their eyes strained from soldering delicate vacuum tube filaments, were working at a feverish pace. Yet, They were essentially building empty vessels. As Crosley watched the freight trains roll out of the rail yards, carrying his wooden boxes into the vast, quiet heartland of America, a profound realization struck him. He was selling ears, but he did not control the mouth. The magic of the radio was entirely dependent on what was drifting through the invisible ether. If the local broadcasts were dull, static-filled, or non-existent, his $20 miracles would simply become silent monuments, gathering dust in the parlors of the working class. He needed to feed the machines. He needed to conjure the voices that would make his boxes indispensable. In March 1922, the industrialist made his audacious move into the unseen realm. He didn't just want to build the hardware, he wanted to command the very atmosphere his machines relied upon. Crosley secured a broadcasting license and launched a station with a modest 20-watt transmitter set up in his own home. He called it WLW. In its infancy, it was a humble, almost comical operation. Crosley himself would play phonograph records into a crude microphone, his voice crackling through the night air to a handful of local enthusiasts. But modesty was never a trait Powell Crosley possessed in abundance. To him, 20 watts was a mere whisper, and he fully intended to roar. It was here that Crosley demonstrated a profound lesson in the architecture of corporate growth. He understood that a product without an ecosystem is merely a novelty. To transform a novelty into a necessity, one must own the environment in which it operates. The logic was an industrial masterstroke. He would build the cheapest radios so everyone could afford to listen. And then he would build the loudest, most entertaining radio station so they would listen exclusively to him. It was a closed-loop ecosystem of unparalleled brilliance. The whisper quickly escalated into a continental shout. By 1924, Crosley had moved WLW out of his living room and into a dedicated state-of-the-art studio in downtown Cincinnati. The physical broadcasting equipment, however, was relocated to a sprawling, desolate field in Harrison, Ohio, and later to Mason. Here, the poetic ambition of the machine age took breathtaking physical form. Massive towers of steel, resembling the skeletal fingers of mythical titans, were erected against the gray Midwestern sky. These were not mere structures. They were the beating heart of a new kind of empire. They hurled invisible lightning across the continent. The power output climbed relentlessly, from 20 watts to 500 to 5,000, and soon to a staggering 50,000 watts. Crosley poured massive capital into these steel sentinels, driving his engineers to relentlessly push the boundaries of physics and electricity. The factory landscape in Cincinnati was now intrinsically linked to these silent, towering giants miles away. The assembly line workers knew they were building the very vessels meant to capture the invisible power radiating from Mason. WLW quickly earned the moniker the Nation Station. It became an auditory lighthouse whose beams swept across the North American continent. Farmers in the isolated valleys of Appalachia, factory hands in Detroit, and insomniacs in the bustling tenements of Chicago all tuned their dials to the same frequency. Crosley didn't just broadcast news. He built a dazzling roster of live musicians, comedians, and soap operas. He had successfully conjured the performers to fill his empty stages. It was a golden age of synergy. The radio manufacturing division funded the immense operating costs of the broadcasting division, and the broadcasting division drove an insatiable, roaring demand for the radios. Powell Crosley Jr. had effectively monetized the sky. He was no longer just a manufacturer. He was the architect of American culture. Dictating the musical tastes and evening routines of millions. Yet every empire of rapid expansion eventually collides with the physical limits of its domain. As the Roaring Twenties drew to a close, the The overwhelming success of WLW and the millions of Crosley receivers flooding the market created a dangerous illusion of infinite growth. The factory floors hummed with a frantic, intoxicating rhythm. Money flowed like a torrential river. But the radio market, once an endless frontier, was beginning to show the first subtle signs of saturation. A machine built with integrity does not need to be replaced every year. Crosley found himself standing at the summit of the broadcasting world, looking out over an empire that was slowly running out of room to expand horizontally. If he could no longer sell a radio to a family that already owned one, he had to invent an entirely new reason for them to open their wallets. The titan of the airwaves had to look back down to the earth, setting his sights on the coldest, most essential frontier of the American home. Every industrial monolith eventually reaches a terrifying crossroad. It must either evolve or suffocate on its own success. By the dawn of the 1930s, Powell Crosley Jr. found himself standing precisely at this juncture. He had successfully colonized the American parlor with his affordable radios, but a machine built with integrity does not invite repeat customers. The invisible frontier of the airwaves had been conquered. It was time to invade the physical architecture of the home. He turned his gaze from the ethereal to the elemental. He turned his ambition toward the kitchen. If the radio was the voice of the modern household, the icebox was its stubborn, primitive stomach. Millions of rural Americans living far beyond the reach of the expanding electrical grid were still chained to the ancient melting rhythm of the ice wagon. Crosley, ever the opportunist for the working class, saw not just a logistical problem, but a vast, untapped vein of capital. His answer was a device that looked less like an appliance and more like a piece of eccentric artillery, the icy ball. It was a bizarre, dumbbell-shaped contraption of sealed steel spheres and pipes. It required absolutely no electricity. A farmer simply had to boil one end over a kerosene stove for an hour, and a volatile internal mixture of water and ammonia would react, causing the opposite end to drop below freezing. It was cheap, it was slightly dangerous if mishandled, and it was a stroke of absolute chaotic genius. With the icy ball, Crosley wasn't just selling refrigeration. He was selling independence from the municipal ice monopolies. But to mass-produce this new arsenal of domestic convenience, the Crosley manufacturing footprint had to undergo a violent physical mutation. The original, relatively modest facilities in Cincinnati were no longer sufficient. They were swallowed by a sprawling, multi-story complex of brick, concrete, and steel in the Camp Washington neighborhood. The Crosley plant morphed into a mythological beast of industry, a smoking, hissing leviathan that cast a long, dark shadow over the city's skyline. The factory floors, once defined by the quiet, meticulous scent of soldering rosin and varnished mahogany, were suddenly overwhelmed by the aggressive stench of raw sheet metal, welding fumes, and chemical refrigerants. The workforce swelled into a small, regimented army. Thousands of men and women poured through the heavy iron gates at dawn, their daily rhythms entirely dictated by the sharp, metallic shriek of the shift whistle. Inside, the landscape was a cathedral of deafening noise. The floor bosses, men who communicated in shouts and sharp, jagged gestures, orchestrated a relentless ballet of heavy manufacturing. There was a grim, muscular humor shared among the line workers, a specific kind of survival camaraderie that only forms when humans are forced to harmonize their fragile bodies with the punishing rhythm of massive machinery. Towering punch presses stamped out steel panels with an earth-shaking force, giving the entire facility a literal thundering heartbeat. Every violent strike of the press was a declaration of Crosley's expanding dominion. Yet, the icy ball was merely a prologue. It was a bridge between the wooden radio cabinets of the past and the gleaming, enameled steel future. The rural markets were briefly satisfied, but the true prize lay in the electrified cities and the rapidly burgeoning suburbs. The industrial beast Crosley had built in Cincinnati was growing ravenous, its overhead costs demanding higher yields. It required a product so universally desired, so inherently clever, that it would force every other manufacturer into a state of panic. It was time to rewrite the geometry of the American kitchen entirely. The answer to Powell Crosley's urban ambition did not emerge from a multi-million-dollar research laboratory, nor did it involve the manipulation of invisible radio frequencies. It came from a breathtakingly simple observation about the geometry of wasted space. In 1932, Crosley acquired the patent rights from an inventor who had noticed that half the volume of a standard icebox was lost to the empty air behind the thick, insulated door. The solution was as elegant as it was revolutionary. Recess the inner panel and add shelves directly to the door itself. Crosley named it the Shelvador. When the Shelvador hit the market, it did not just sell. It caused a nationwide frenzy. Suddenly, housewives across America could store their milk, eggs, and small jars without burying them behind mountains of leftovers. It was a domestic revelation that instantly rendered every other refrigerator in the country obsolete. Competitors scrambled, but Crosley had the patent locked in an iron grip. The Shelvador became the crown jewel of the American kitchen, and its explosive popularity forced the Camp Washington factory to mutate once again. If the radio division was a realm of nimble fingers and delicate wiring, the new refrigerator division became a mythical underworld of heavy industry. The manufacturing of the Shelvador required the manipulation of steel on a titanic scale. The factory floor expanded to encompass a staggering 600,000 square feet. It was a landscape of stark contrasts, a place of punishing heat designed to produce machines of absolute cold. To coat the steel cabinets in their signature gleaming white finish, Crosley installed massive porcelain enameling ovens. These mechanical beasts roared at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The workers who manned this section moved like figures in a Vulcan forge, their skin slick with sweat, and their faces illuminated by the violent orange glow of the liquid glass. The air in the enameling department was thick, radiating a dry, oppressive heat that tested the limits of human endurance. It was a brutal, poetic ballet. Raw, ugly sheets of dark steel were swallowed by the fire, only to emerge moments later as pristine, immaculate monuments to modern hygiene. By the late 1930s, the Crosley Corporation had become a two-headed leviathan. On one side, it was shipping out millions of delicate radios. On the other, it was hauling hundreds of thousands of heavy steel refrigerators onto freight cars. The payroll swelled to over 3,000 men and women. The Camp Washington plant was no longer merely a factory. It was an autonomous, breathing city within the borders of Cincinnati. It had its own internal railroad system, its own hospital, its own cafeteria, and its own deafening, mechanical heartbeat. There is a profound irony in this era of the company's history. Powell Crosley Jr., the visionary who had built his name by conquering the weightless, invisible ether of radio waves, had cemented his true fortune in the heaviest, most earthbound appliances imaginable. Yet this monumental success carried a hidden, dangerous weight. The transition from nimble electronics to heavy appliance manufacturing fundamentally altered the DNA of the corporation. Crosley was now chained to massive overhead costs, vast supply chains of raw steel and chemical refrigerants, and the immense logistical nightmare of shipping heavy freight. The factory was a beast that had to be fed constantly. If the assembly lines ever stopped moving, the sheer cost of maintaining the dormant machinery would hemorrhage the company's wealth in a matter of months. Crosley had built an industrial machine that could not afford to slow down. The stakes had reached an astronomical high, but as the 1930s bled into a new, uncertain decade, the world outside the sprawling brick walls of Cincinnati was fracturing. The massive infrastructure Crosley had constructed for peacetime convenience was about to be violently repurposed. The roaring machinery of the American living room was on a direct collision course with the most destructive force the world had ever seen. Before the world fractured into global conflict, the Crosley Empire reached an inflection point of almost absurd, mythological proportions. If Powell Crosley Jr. was the architect of this industrial kingdom, the WLW Broadcasting Tower in Mason, Ohio, was his towering steel Olympus. In 1934, unsatisfied with merely dominating the regional airwaves, Crosley secured experimental permission from the federal government to push his transmitter to a mind-bending 500,000 watts. To put this into perspective, modern commercial radio stations are legally capped at 1/10 of that power. When the master switch was thrown, the sky above the Midwest was effectively electrified. The signal was so violently powerful it bordered on the supernatural, creating a chaotic, dark comedy of physics in the surrounding farm towns. Barbed wire fences mysteriously picked up the evening news. Metal bed springs hummed with the faint metallic rhythm of big band orchestras. Unplugged incandescent bulbs spontaneously ignited in the dead of night. Crosley had forged a technological thunderbolt, commanding a nightly audience that stretched from the freezing harbors of Canada down to the humid ports of South America. It was the ultimate manifestation of industrial hubris. A single, earthbound corporation controlling the whispers of an entire hemisphere. But this golden age of civilian dominance, built on the steady sale of cheap radios and gleaming white refrigerators, was abruptly shattered on a quiet Sunday in December 1941. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States government did not merely ask for corporate assistance, it drafted the nation's entire industrial soul. The sprawling Camp Washington facility, a massive beast that had grown fat on the desires of the American consumer, was forced into a rapid, brutal metamorphosis. Overnight, the production of the beloved Shelvador ceased entirely. The lively, varnished wood cabinets of parlor radios were swept off the assembly lines. The factory floor, once a cathedral dedicated to domestic convenience, was violently repurposed into a fortress of war. The massive enameling ovens, which had baked the pristine white finishes onto civilian iceboxes, were shut down. Their warm orange glow was replaced by the cold, utilitarian glare of heavy industrial lighting and the sharp, acrid stench of military-grade machinery grease. The very landscape of the plant became unrecognizable. The massive factory windows were painted pitch black to thwart the threat of enemy bombers. Armed military guards, grim and silent, began patrolling the perimeter of a sprawling brick campus that used to proudly host public tours. Inside, the complexion of the workforce shifted dramatically. With thousands of young men shipping off to the front lines of Europe and the Pacific, the factory floor swelled with a new legion of women. These were the same nimble hands that had once meticulously soldered the delicate glass vacuum tubes of the $20 Harco radio. Now, under an atmosphere of suffocating secrecy and intense, unrelenting pressure, they were drafted into wiring the nervous systems of mobile military transceivers and heavy bomber turrets. The air in the factory grew thick with a new, heavier kind of tension. There was no longer the rhythmic, predictable hum of peacetime commerce. It was replaced by the frantic, exhaustingly high-stakes tempo of national survival. Every rivet driven, every wire cut, carried the invisible weight of a human life hanging in the balance overseas. Yet amidst the deafening clatter of Jeep parts and field radios, a small, heavily guarded section of the Camp Washington labyrinth was preparing to build something entirely different. It was a mechanical device so profoundly destructive and so deeply classified that the very workers assembling it were forbidden from knowing its purpose. The Crosley machine was about to give birth to a secret weapon that would irrevocably alter the course of the war. The secret weapon was a marvel of miniature engineering, a device that perfectly weaponized Powell Crosley's mastery of the radio wave. It was called the proximity fuse. Before this invention, anti-aircraft gunners had to manually set mechanical timers on artillery shells, hoping they would explode at the exact altitude of an incoming enemy plane. It was a deadly, inefficient guessing game. The proximity fuse changed the mathematics of modern warfare. It was essentially a microscopic radio transmitter and receiver packed into the nose of an artillery shell. As the shell flew through the air, it broadcast a continuous radio signal. When that signal bounced off a solid target, a plane, a ship, or the ground, the fuse detected the echo and detonated the explosive at the precise moment of maximum destruction. To make this work, the fragile glass vacuum tubes, which usually sat safely inside a polished mahogany cabinet in a quiet living room, had to be heavily reinforced to survive being shot out of a cannon at 20,000 times the force of gravity. It was a manufacturing nightmare, but the engineers and line workers at Crosley mastered it. The Camp Washington factory, along with a network of newly acquired satellite facilities, began churning out these miniature radios of death. The operation was shrouded in a level of classification matched only by the development of the atomic bomb. The women on the line assembling the delicate components were intentionally kept in the dark about the final product. They worked in strict compartmentalized rooms, inspecting tiny filaments under magnifying glasses, oblivious to the fact that their tedious labor was creating the very devices that would help shatter the Japanese Air Force in the Pacific and decimate German V-1 flying bombs over the skies of London. By the peak of the war, the Crosley Corporation was no longer a civilian enterprise. It was a vital organ of the Allied military apparatus. They produced millions of proximity fuse, alongside 500,000 field radios, thousands of water purification units, and heavy bomber turrets. The financial compensation from the federal government was staggering. On paper, Powell Crosley Jr. had reached the absolute, undeniable zenith of his industrial power. His factories were winning a global war. But underneath the monumental production numbers, a quiet, insidious fatigue was taking root. The company was redlining. The massive factories in Cincinnati were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, pushing both the heavy machinery and the human workforce to the absolute brink of exhaustion. More significantly, the war effort had violently severed the Crosley brand from its original consumer base. For 4 long years, the name Crosley vanished from the American consumer market. The brilliant marketing machine that had once commanded the public's daily attention was forced into silence. Powell Crosley Jr. himself, now entering his late 50s, was visibly worn down by the crushing bureaucratic demands of government contracts and the immense stress of continuous, high-stakes military manufacturing. The titan who had eagerly conquered the invisible airwaves and the American kitchen was beginning to lose his appetite for the endless industrial grind. As 1945 approached and the global conflict began to draw to a close, the corporation faced a terrifying new reality. The lucrative, bottomless government contracts would soon evaporate. The giant, heavily militarized factory would have to pivot back to a civilian market that had rapidly evolved during its absence. It was a perilous transition for any corporation, requiring absolute focus and immense capital. But Powell Crosley was about to make it infinitely harder. Instead of focusing every ounce of energy on reclaiming his lost empire of household appliances, he was preparing to resurrect a ghost from his past, a stubborn, impractical obsession that would violently derail the company's post-war future. The guns fell silent in the late summer of 1945. Almost overnight, the deafening roar of the military-industrial complex ground to an abrupt, uneasy halt. At the massive Crosley facilities in Cincinnati, the sudden absence of strict government production quotas left a terrifying vacuum on the assembly floors. The corporation was financially bloated from years of lucrative defense contracts, sitting on a formidable mountain of wartime capital. The obvious mathematically sound path forward was to immediately pivot back and reclaim their undisputed throne in the American home. The nation, having been starved of domestic consumer goods for 4 agonizing years, was standing by with open wallets, desperate for new radios, updated refrigerators, and the thrilling, rapidly emerging miracle of television. But Powell Crosley Jr. was a man uniquely haunted by his own past. Long before he conquered the invisible airwaves or revolutionized the geometry of the icebox, his first, deepest ambition had been to build automobiles. That initial dream had ended in embarrassing failure. Now, sitting atop an industrial empire with seemingly unlimited financial resources, the temptation to resurrect his automotive ghost proved intoxicating. He looked out at the post-war landscape and made a deeply personal calculation, one that would systematically dismantle his manufacturing legacy. Instead of dominating the impending post-war appliance boom, Crosley diverted his focus to a radical, highly impractical vision. He believed the future of American transportation belonged to the purely utilitarian. He envisioned a nation of thrifty commuters driving tiny, incredibly fuel-efficient vehicles that could easily navigate crowded city streets and be purchased for a fraction of the cost of a standard sedan. It was the Crosley microcar. He had briefly introduced a primitive version of this vehicle in 1939, famously selling them in department stores right next to his refrigerators, but the war had suspended the experiment. Now, with the war won, he was ready to bet the sheer momentum of his entire corporation on 4 tiny wheels. The tragedy of the Crosley automobile was not necessarily a failure of mechanical engineering, but a catastrophic failure to read the emotional temperature of the American public. The United States had just emerged victorious from a grueling global conflict. Its citizens did not feel small, and they certainly did not want to spend their newfound economic power on cars that made them look small. The post-war American psyche was triumphant, expansive, and hungry for undeniable displays of prosperity. While Powell Crosley was meticulously designing an 80-inch wheelbase microcar aimed at saving a few pennies on gasoline, the automotive titans in Detroit, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, were quietly drawing up blueprints for massive rolling steel palaces. The public wanted heavy, gleaming chrome, plush interiors, and the deep, throaty roar of powerful V8 engines. Crosley was offering them a stripped-down, 2-cylinder carriage that weighed barely 1,000 pounds and looked more like an enclosed golf cart than a highway cruiser. Blinded by his stubborn adherence to his own utilitarian philosophy, Crosley began aggressively siphoning millions of dollars away from his core business. The brilliant engineers who should have been designing the next generation of the Shelvador refrigerator or aggressively pioneering the company's entry into the explosive new television market were instead drafted to troubleshoot the suspension of a microcar. He purchased entirely new manufacturing facilities in Marion, Indiana, dedicating vast amounts of corporate capital to mass-produce the vehicles. The sprawling Camp Washington appliance plant in Cincinnati, the very engine that had generated his actual wealth and sustained the company through the Great Depression, was suddenly treated as a secondary priority within its own ecosystem. The core products were left to coast on aging, pre-war designs, slowly bleeding their competitive edge, while the aging founder chased an automotive mirage that the American public fundamentally did not want. The microcar project was not just a strategic distraction, it was a mechanical tragedy, built on a foundation of brilliant, yet fatally flawed engineering. The heart of the post-war Crosley automobile was an engine called the Cobra, short for copper brazed. Instead of casting the engine block out of heavy iron, as was the absolute industry standard, Crosley's engineers stamped it from sheet metal and brazed the pieces together with copper in a massive furnace. It was an astonishingly light, high-revving marvel that had successfully powered portable military generators during the war. But a generator running at a steady, predictable speed in a military camp is an entirely different beast from an automobile engine facing the brutal, fluctuating demands of daily civilian driving. Almost immediately upon release in 1946, the Cobra engines began to fail spectacularly. The harsh, unregulated anti-freeze mixtures of the era violently attacked the copper brazing. The engines warped, leaked, and effectively dissolved from the inside out. Dealerships were suddenly flooded with furious customers dragging in dead vehicles. Crosley was forced to swiftly replace the defective engines with heavy cast-iron blocks at a massive, bleeding financial cost, but the reputational damage was already fatal. The American public quickly branded the Crosley not just as an awkwardly tiny car, but as a fundamentally unreliable one. Even if the engine had been perfect, the physical reality of driving a Crosley on a post-war American road was a terrifying ordeal. Weighing a mere 1,100 pounds, the vehicle was violently buffeted by the wake of passing trucks. While the rest of the nation was accelerating down newly paved highways in heavy, commanding steel cruisers, the Crosley driver was a fragile outlier, puttering along in a claustrophobic box that offered zero protection and minimal comfort. It was a vehicle designed for a European style of post-war austerity that simply did not exist in the booming, victorious United States. The financial hemorrhage from the automotive division was profound. Between 1945 and 1952, Crosley managed to sell roughly 84,000 cars, a rounding error compared to the millions of vehicles pouring out of the Detroit assembly lines. But the true cost was not merely in the millions of dollars lost in Indiana. It was in the agonizing opportunity cost paid in Ohio. Every ounce of Powell Crosley's attention, every dollar pumped into the failing automobile plant, was a dollar and a thought stolen from his true kingdom in Cincinnati. Inside the colossal Camp Washington plant, the atmosphere fundamentally shifted. The deafening, confident roar of the 1930s was replaced by a creeping, bureaucratic stagnation. The workers on the appliance lines, who had once prided themselves on building the absolute cutting edge of domestic technology, found themselves assembling aging designs. The momentum had clearly vanished. They were no longer the vanguard. They were a massive, aging machine struggling to maintain its footing. While the founder tinkered with his failing four-wheeled dream, a terrifying new phenomenon was beginning to glow in the living rooms of his former customers. Television. The very medium that Crosley's radio empire should have naturally dominated was exploding across the nation. Competitors like RCA, Zenith, and General Electric were aggressively pouring their wartime profits into this new visual frontier. The Crosley Corporation, hamstrung by its automotive vanity project, was dangerously sluggish to adapt. Their entry into the television market was delayed, and their refrigerators faced fierce new competition from massive conglomerates. By the end of the 1940s, the man who had once dictated the technological pulse of America found himself exhausted and utterly out of sync with the culture he had helped create. Powell Crosley Jr., staring at the mounting losses of his automobile venture and the looming, incredibly expensive transition required to compete in the television age, realized his time as a relentless industrial conqueror was coming to a close. The empire had become too heavy, the market was moving too fast, and the aging visionary was simply too tired to carry the weight of the machine anymore. The most dangerous moment for any industrial empire is not necessarily when it is under attack by competitors, but when its architect simply grows tired of ruling it. By the summer of 1945, as the heavy smoke of the Second World War finally cleared, the sprawling Camp Washington facility was primed to reclaim its title as the king of the American living room. The assembly lines were ready to be converted back to peacetime production. Millions of citizens had money in their pockets and were desperate for new appliances. Yet standing at the summit of this unprecedented economic opportunity, Powell Crosley Jr. felt an overwhelming sense of fatigue. He was 60 years old. He had survived the chaotic Wild West days of early radio broadcasting, navigated the crushing economic despair of the Great Depression through sheer mechanical ingenuity, and borne the immense, terrifying responsibility of manufacturing secret weapons for a global war. The relentless, grinding momentum of the machine he had built was beginning to crush him. Furthermore, the technological landscape of the post-war world was shifting with terrifying speed. Radio, the medium Crosley had helped democratize and conquer, was suddenly being overshadowed by a mesmerizing new invention: television. To dominate this new, glowing frontier would require a massive reinvestment of capital, a complete retooling of the engineering departments, and a fierce, exhausting war against corporate leviathans like RCA and Zenith. Crosley, whose heart and mind were increasingly consumed by his disastrous microcar obsession, looked at the looming television revolution and felt a profound apathy. He simply lacked the desire to fight another bruising technological war. And so, in a move that stunned the industrial world and sent shockwaves through the city of Cincinnati, the man whose name was bolted onto millions of American household machines decided to walk away. He chose to sell the very soul of his empire. The buyer was the Aviation Corporation, a massive holding company that would soon become known as AVCO. Born out of the booming aerospace industry, AVCO was flush with a staggering amount of wartime cash and was aggressively seeking to diversify its portfolio into consumer goods. They were not a company built on a single man's eccentric vision. They were a cold, calculating conglomerate driven entirely by boardrooms, shareholders, and profit margins. To AVCO, the Crosley Corporation was not a family legacy. It was not a passionate crusade to provide affordable technology to the working class. It was simply a highly lucrative, easily exploitable asset. In 1945, the ink dried on a monumental transaction. AVCO purchased the core of the Crosley Corporation, the sprawling appliance factories, the legendary radio manufacturing division, and the crown jewel, the 50,000-watt WLW broadcasting station. The price was $21 million. It was a king's ransom at the time, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. As the colossal check cleared, Powell Crosley Jr. systematically severed himself from the very foundation of his success. He retained ownership of only two peripheral entities, his beloved doomed microcar division and the Cincinnati Reds baseball team. For the thousands of men and women working the lines at Camp Washington, the announcement of the sale felt like a sudden, chilling drop in barometric pressure. They had spent decades working for a man, a stubborn, deeply flawed, visionary human being who had walked the factory floors and shaped the company in his own image. Now, overnight, they were the property of an invisible, faceless corporate entity headquartered in New York. The physical machinery of the factory remained exactly the same, but the spirit of the enterprise had been legally transferred, setting the stage for a slow, methodical dismantling of everything Powell Crosley had built. When the executives from the Aviation Corporation arrived at the sprawling Camp Washington facility in late 1945, they did not see a historical monument to American broadcasting or a cathedral of domestic engineering. They saw a highly optimized, incredibly lucrative line item on a corporate spreadsheet. The men in tailored suits who walked the catwalks above the deafening enameling ovens had no personal connection to the $20 Harco radio that had built the company, nor did they understand the visceral, chaotic energy of the early WLW broadcasting days. They were efficiency experts, financial engineers, and managers of a sprawling conglomerate. Powell Crosley Jr. physically left the building, taking his $21 million fortune with him. In a tragic stroke of irony, he used a massive portion of this new capital to blindly finance the disastrous final years of his microcar division in Indiana, desperately trying to breathe life into a vehicle the American public actively rejected. When he wasn't hemorrhaging money on his four-wheeled folly, he retreated into the comforting, predictable geometry of a baseball diamond, pouring his remaining energy into managing the Cincinnati Reds. The industrialist had effectively abandoned his defining creation. On the assembly lines in Cincinnati, the shift in leadership was felt almost immediately, not through dramatic firings or immediate closures, but through a slow, suffocating wave of corporate bureaucracy. Under Crosley's reign, the company possessed a distinct unifying philosophy: good technology at the lowest possible price. It was an ethos driven by an eccentric, stubborn founder who could walk the floor and greenlight wild ideas like the icy ball on pure instinct. Under AVCO, that unifying soul vanished. The new directive was brutally simple: maximize quarterly profits and extract as much value from the brand name as mathematically possible. The engineering department, once a vibrant hotbed of rapid innovation, suddenly found itself paralyzed by endless approval processes and committee meetings. While competitors like Whirlpool and General Electric were fiercely pouring money into research and development, AVCO instructed the Crosley Appliance Division to coast on its existing reputation. The legendary Shelvador refrigerator, once a revolutionary piece of engineering, began to suffer from subtle, invisible compromises. Cheaper materials were quietly substituted. The heavy, indestructible feel of the pre-war appliances was gradually replaced by lighter, flimsier components designed to pad the profit margins. The workers on the floor, many of whom had spent decades harmonizing their lives with the rhythm of the punch presses, recognized the fatal shift. The pride of craftsmanship was being systematically replaced by the cold metrics of a quota. AVCO had successfully purchased the body of the largest radio and appliance manufacturer in the Midwest. But they fundamentally did not know how to generate the innovative spirit that kept the heart beating. As the calendar turned over into the 1950s, the golden era of the American consumer boom was entering its most aggressive phase. The suburbs were expanding, the highways were rolling out, and millions of homes were being wired for television. But the Crosley Corporation, now a hollowed-out subsidiary of an indifferent aerospace conglomerate, was stepping onto this new battlefield completely unarmed. The machine was still running, the smoke still billowed from the Camp Washington stacks, but the empire had already begun to die from the inside out. The Camp Washington facility, once a roaring leviathan that breathed the Promethean fire of the 20th century, was slowly being suffocated by paper. Under the reign of Powell Crosley Jr., the factory floor possessed a chaotic, mythical energy, a place where a sudden spark of imagination could instantly command thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of hands. But when the Aviation Corporation, AVCO, assumed full control, the high priests of engineering were quietly replaced by the cold, calculating clerics of accounting. The cathedral of American manufacturing was meticulously measured, neatly categorized, and systematically stripped of its soul. The transition was not a sudden, violent death, but a slow, agonizing drain of vitality. AVCO did not understand the intricate, sweaty romance of building things for the working class. To the executives in New York, a refrigerator was not a vessel of modern health or a marvel of thermodynamics. It was merely a unit of profit. The mandate handed down to the Cincinnati plant was brutally clear: squeeze every possible drop of equity from the Crosley name while minimizing reinvestment. It was the industrial equivalent of starving a workhorse to save on oats, while demanding it pull the plow at the exact same relentless speed. The dismantling began invisibly, hidden deep within the walls of the beloved Shelvador. The engineering department, a legendary enclave that had successfully miniaturized radio waves into artillery fuses during the global war, found itself engaged in the deeply tragicomic business of corporate penny pinching. The brilliant minds of the machine age were drafted into fierce, agonizing debates over how to shave 3 cents off the production of a plastic butter tray. The heavy, indestructible gauge of the steel doors was quietly swapped for a thinner, hollower sheet. The satisfying mechanical thud of a closing Crosley refrigerator, a sound that once signaled absolute, unquestionable reliability, was replaced by a tinny, rattling clatter. The heavy chrome handles gave way to brittle, cheap plastics. There is a dark, bitter humor in watching a technological empire try to counterfeit its own legacy. Crosley was no longer the pioneer of good technology at the lowest possible price. Under AVCO, it became the purveyor of compromised technology at the highest possible margin. The public, however, is rarely fooled for long by a hollowed-out monument. While Crosley coasted on the evaporating fumes of its pre-war reputation, the post-war appliance market mutated into an absolute bloodbath of innovation. A new breed of corporate titans awoke. General Electric, Whirlpool, and Frigidaire unleashed a tidal wave of capital, transforming the American kitchen from a sterile, utilitarian workspace into a pastel-colored sanctuary of suburban leisure. They built massive integrated supply chains and poured millions into the new, mesmerizing medium of television advertising. The very medium Crosley should have naturally dominated, had they not been distracted by microcars and corporate buyouts. Against this gleaming, heavily funded onslaught, the cheapened Crosley appliances looked exactly like what they had become. Relics of a bygone, Depression-era mentality. The physical factory in Cincinnati struggled to keep up the charade. The deafening, rhythmic heartbeat of the enameling ovens and the giant punch presses began to stutter. The thousands of line workers, who possessed a profound, muscle memory understanding of quality, were forced to knowingly assemble inferior machines. The fierce pride of the factory floor evaporated, replaced by the grim, clock-punching apathy of laborers who inherently knew they were building a dying brand. The fatal blow came from the very arteries of the business, the distribution network. Powell Crosley had built his empire through a fiercely loyal army of independent appliance dealers across the rural and urban landscapes. But as the physical quality of the shelvador plummeted and warranty claims spiked, these independent shopkeepers faced furious customers dragging in broken units. Simultaneously, General Electric and Whirlpool agents were arriving at the back doors of these shops with superior products, better profit margins, and the undeniable backing of national television campaigns. One by one, the dealers quietly unbolted the Crosley signs from their storefronts. In a desperate, flailing attempt to save the division, AVCO purchased the Bendix Corporation, famous for its automatic washing machines, and violently mashed the two identities together. They created Crosley Bendix, a Frankenstein's monster of a brand that only served to further confuse the consumer base. The synergy was a total failure. The radios, once the crown jewels of the company, were outsourced, cheapened, and practically abandoned. The magic boxes that had once commanded the American ether were reduced to generic, static-filled novelties. By the mid-1950s, the mathematics of the spreadsheet became impossible to ignore. The appliance division was hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate. The corporate boardrooms of AVCO, completely devoid of sentimentality, looked at the red numbers and passed the final verdict. There would be no grand rescue package, no visionary redesign, no emotional appeal to the legacy of the Henry Ford of radio. In 1956, AVCO officially decreed that the Crosley name would be permanently retired from the consumer appliance and radio markets. It was a sterile, bureaucratic execution. With a single stroke of a pen in a distant skyscraper, a brand that had wired a fractured nation together, conquered the freezing temperatures of the rural kitchen, and armed the Allied bombers of the Second World War. was officially declared dead. The mythical beast had been entirely devoured by the spreadsheet, leaving behind nothing but the cold, quiet machinery of an impending shutdown. There is a specific, agonizing acoustics to a dying factory. It does not happen all at once. The death of a massive industrial complex is a slow, piecemeal silencing, a gradual unwinding of a colossal mechanical clock that has lost its mainspring. For 3 decades, the Camp Washington facility had operated with a deafening, rhythmic heartbeat. The ground literally shook with the violent impact of massive steel punch presses. The air continuously hissed with the release of pneumatic valves and roared with the deep, suffocating heat of the porcelain enameling ovens. It was an environment so loud that workers communicated in a specialized sign language, reading lips and gestures across the chaotic floor. But as the 1950s marched on, that mighty roar began to fracture. The first profound silence actually fell a few hundred miles away, in Marion, Indiana. In 1952, 4 years before AVCO officially executed the Crosley appliance brand, Powell Crosley Jr. was finally forced to confront the fatal mathematics of his four-wheeled folly. The American public had delivered its absolute, undeniable verdict. They did not want the Crosley microcar. Facing catastrophic financial hemorrhaging, the aging visionary ordered the assembly lines to halt. The remaining inventory was liquidated, the specialized machinery was sold for scrap, and the automotive division was permanently dissolved. It was a crushing, humiliating defeat for a man who had once dictated the technological habits of an entire continent. His most passionate personal dream had ended in complete rejection. With his automotive ambitions dead, Powell Crosley Jr. retreated further into the shadows, leaving his original appliance and radio empire entirely at the mercy of the Aviation Corporation. And AVCO, staring at the declining sales and the fierce, unyielding dominance of competitors like General Electric and Whirlpool, had no intention of a rescue mission. In the late summer of 1956, the final decree was handed down from the corporate boardrooms in New York. The Crosley brand was to be officially retired. The massive manufacturing apparatus in Cincinnati was to be systematically dismantled. The physical process of shutting down the Camp Washington plant was a grim, funereal undertaking. First, the supply chains were severed. The endless line of freight trains delivering raw sheet metal, copper wire, and chemical refrigerants slowed to a halt, leaving the massive loading docks eerily vacant. Then, the enameling ovens, the terrifying glowing beasts that had baked the gleaming white armor onto millions of Shelvador refrigerators, were powered down. For days, the massive brick structures radiated a residual dying heat until they finally grew cold and dark, their interiors thick with the hardened, glassy residue of a bygone era. Section by section, the lights above the assembly floors were switched off. The heavy punch presses were unbolted from the concrete foundations, their hydraulic fluids drained, leaving dark, oily stains on the factory floor, like the blood of a slaughtered leviathan. The delicate workstations where thousands of women had meticulously wired the proximity fuses that helped win a global war were rapidly disassembled and tossed into dumpsters. But the most devastating silence was not the absence of the machinery, it was the absence of the people. On the final day of production, thousands of men and women walked out through the heavy iron gates of the Camp Washington complex for the last time. These were not transient laborers. For many, this factory had been the defining gravitational center of their entire existence. It was the place where they had met their spouses, where they had earned the steady wages to buy their first homes, and where they had built solid, middle-class American lives. They possessed a deep, muscle memory understanding of the machines they operated, a profound pride in the radios and appliances they had shipped across the globe. Now, they were simply collateral damage on a corporate ledger. They carried their dented metal lunchboxes and personal tools out into the unforgiving daylight of the mid-1950s, leaving behind an echoing, cavernous void. The localized economy of the surrounding neighborhood, built entirely to feed and service the massive workforce, immediately began to wither. The bustling diners, the corner taverns, and the local hardware stores lost their lifeblood almost overnight. The monumental broadcasting tower in Mason, Ohio, which had once hurled the 500,000-watt roar of the Crosley Empire across the hemisphere, still stood against the Midwestern sky. But it was now a quiet, muted sentinel. The corporation that had built it, the visionary who had willed it into existence, and the tens of thousands of hands that had assembled its receivers were all gone. The Camp Washington complex, encompassing hundreds of thousands of square feet of brick, glass, and concrete, sat entirely empty. The Henry Ford of radio had built an empire to conquer the American living room, but in the end, he had left his own city with nothing but a colossal, silent ghost ship anchored in the heart of the industrial Midwest. For a long time after the final shift whistle blew in 1956, the story of the Crosley Corporation seemed destined to fade into the quiet, dusty archives of Midwestern industrial history. Powell Crosley, Jr., the visionary who had conjured an empire out of a $20 radio, did not live long enough to see his legacy completely forgotten, but he lived exactly long enough to witness its systematic dismantling. In March 1961, he suffered a fatal heart attack at the age of 74. He died a wealthy man, primarily sustained by his ownership of the Cincinnati Reds, but from an industrial standpoint, he died entirely defeated. The colossal manufacturing machine he had built to conquer the American living room had already been cannibalized. Following his death, the physical footprint of his empire slowly dissolved. The sprawling, multi-story brick complex in Camp Washington, which once housed thousands of workers and roared with the deafening heat of porcelain enameling ovens, fell into disrepair. Parts of it were eventually repurposed, broken up, or demolished entirely. The legendary WLW Broadcasting Tower in Mason, Ohio, remained standing, but it had long been stripped of its terrifying 500,000-watt power. Neutered by federal regulations, it was reduced to a standard commercial signal, a quiet monument to a bygone era of technological hubris. For decades, the name Crosley existed only as a dead language. It was a word spoken primarily by antique collectors hunting for heavy, wood-paneled radios at estate sales, or by mechanics occasionally stumbling across the rusted skeletal remains of a microcar in a rural barn. The brand was extinct. But in the strange, hyper-commercialized landscape of modern capitalism, a famous name is rarely allowed to rest in peace. By the late 20th century, a new generation of marketing executives realized that as the physical reality of American manufacturing died, the nostalgia for American manufacturing was becoming a highly lucrative commodity. In the 1980s, the dormant Crosley trademark was legally purchased by an entirely new entity. This modern company did not buy factories in Cincinnati. They did not hire thousands of skilled line workers or invest millions in cutting-edge engineering research. They simply bought a piece of paper, a legal right to use a name that vaguely sounded like authentic mid-century Americana. This act of corporate necromancy birthed the modern iteration of Crosley, a brand famous today not for pioneering new technology, but for mass-producing the illusion of the past. Walk into any modern big-box retail store or trendy urban boutique today, and you will see the Crosley name stamped onto millions of portable, suitcase-style record players and retro-styled Bluetooth speakers. These devices are explicitly designed to look like the golden age of manufacturing. They feature pastel colors, faux leather bindings, and vintage-style dials. But beneath the carefully curated aesthetic, they are entirely hollow. They are assembled in massive overseas factories, utilizing the cheapest possible, lightweight plastic components. They are not built to last for generations, nor are they designed to push the boundaries of acoustic fidelity. They are manufactured to satisfy a fleeting aesthetic trend, offering a cheap, disposable veneer of authenticity to a generation desperate for physical media. The irony is profound and deeply tragic. Powell Crosley Jr. built his entire philosophy on democratizing the future. He wanted to take the absolute cutting edge of human invention, radio waves, modern refrigeration, mechanical engineering, and make it accessible to the working class. He was obsessed with what was coming next. The modern ghost that wears his name does the exact opposite. It sells a sanitized, plastic version of the past. When a consumer today purchases a Crosley Cruiser turntable, they are not buying a piece of the roaring 500-kilowatt empire. They are buying a phantom limb, the heavy stamped steel of the Camp Washington presses, the intricate, high-stakes wiring of the wartime proximity fuses, and the thousands of Cincinnati families whose livelihoods were tied to the chaotic genius of an industrial titan. All of that is completely divorced from the plastic box sitting on a modern bookshelf. The true legacy of the Crosley Corporation is not found in a retro-styled record player. It is found in the silence. It is found in the empty spaces of the American Rust Belt, in the memories of the workers who once built indestructible machines with their own hands, and in the harsh, enduring lesson that even the loudest, most powerful industrial empires on Earth can be quietly dismantled, sold for parts, and reduced to nothing more than a hollow brand. There is a profound, almost mythological rhythm to the life cycle of American industry. We often believe that empires fall because they are conquered from the outside, bested by faster competitors or revolutionary technologies. But the story of the Crosley Corporation reveals a far more tragic and human truth. A manufacturing empire does not die when its machines break down. It dies when its creators forget why the machines were built in the first place. Powell Crosley Jr. was not just a businessman, he was an industrial alchemist. He looked at the exclusive, expensive magic of the radio wave and the terrifying heat of the foundry, and he forged them into tools for the common man. He built a kingdom on the radical idea that the future should be affordable. But like so many titans of the machine age, his ambition eventually outgrew his focus. He became distracted by four-wheeled illusions, and in his exhaustion, he handed his living, breathing creation over to a cold, corporate spreadsheet. The tragedy of Camp Washington is not that the factory eventually closed. All things eventually do. The tragedy is that its soul was dismantled long before the final shift whistle ever blew. It is a stark reminder that true innovation requires more than just capital and efficiency. It requires a stubborn, passionate human heart at the center of the machine. When you strip the humanity from the assembly line, you are left with nothing but heavy steel and inevitable silence. Today, as we navigate our own era of dizzying technological expansion, the ghosts of Cincinnati ask us to look closely at the empires we are building. Are we creating enduring value for the many, or are we just maximizing the margins for the few? Thank you for walking through the quiet ruins of this American giant with us. If this journey through the triumphs and failures of industrial history resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below.